He never thought the quiet evening at Murphy's Diner would explode into chaos. The sound of roaring Harley engines filled the peaceful mountain town of Pine Ridge as the notorious Shadow Riders motorcycle gang rolled in, already drunk and looking for trouble. For retired Marine Master Sergeant David Reeves, the next few minutes would test everything he'd learned in 20 years of service. But what these arrogant troublemakers didn't know, what no one in this small town knew, was that they were about to start a fight with one of the most decorated Force Recon Marines in recent history. Some lessons are learned the hard way, and tonight the Shadow Riders would learn theirs. The autumn evening had settled gently over Pine Ridge, Colorado, the kind of small mountain town where everybody knows everybody, and the biggest excitement usually comes from high school football games. Murphy's Diner sat at the corner of Main and Cedar, its neon sign casting a warm glow across the weathered wooden sidewalk. The red and blue "Open 24 Hours" sign flickered steadily in the growing dusk, a beacon for locals seeking Sarah Murphy's famous apple pie and the best coffee in 3 counties. David Reeves sat in his usual booth by the window, nursing his third cup of coffee as he graded papers from his high school history class. At 45, his military bearing was still evident in his straight posture and alert eyes, though he'd traded his Marine Corps uniform for comfortable jeans and a flannel shirt. The transition to civilian life hadn't been easy, but teaching had given him a new mission, a way to serve that didn't involve combat zones or midnight operations. Sarah Murphy, the diner's owner and a widow of a Vietnam veteran herself, topped off his coffee with practiced ease. "Those midterm essays keeping you busy, David?" she asked, her lined face crinkling with warmth. She'd taken David under her wing when he'd first moved to Pine Ridge 3 years ago, recognizing the look of a warrior trying to find his place in a peaceful world. "Some of these kids have fascinating perspectives on World War II, David replied, marking another paper with his red pen. Tommy Martinez actually drew parallels between the Pacific Theater and modern counterinsurgency operations that I hadn't considered. His weathered hands, marked with scars from battles he never discussed, carefully arranged the papers into neat stacks. The diner was quiet for a Wednesday evening. Old Bill Cooper dozed in his corner booth, his ever-present John Deere cap pulled low over his eyes. The Martinez family occupied a table near the kitchen, their young children coloring placemats while their parents enjoyed a rare night out. Jenny, the young waitress working her way through community college, wiped down tables while humming along to the classic rock playing softly through the diner's speakers. Through the window, David watched the sun setting behind the Rocky Mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Pine Ridge nestled in the valley below, its streets lined with historic buildings that hadn't changed much since the mining boom of the 1890s. It was about as far from the war zones of his past as he could get, and that's exactly why he'd chosen it. The first distant rumble of motorcycles barely registered. Pine Ridge occasionally saw touring bikes passing through, usually retired couples or weekend warriors exploring the mountain roads. But something about this rumble was different. David recognized it immediately, the distinctive sound of multiple Harleys running straight pipes, the kind of modification that screamed for attention. His combat-trained senses, never fully dormant, began to stir. Sarah paused in her rounds, coffee pot suspended mid-pour. "That doesn't sound like our usual or tourists," she said, her voice carrying a note of concern. She'd been running the diner long enough to know when trouble was brewing. The rumble grew louder, accompanied by the screech of tires and raucous laughter. Through the diner's broad front windows, David watched as 5 motorcycles roared into view, followed by 3 more. The bikes were all custom choppers, chrome gleaming menacingly in the fading daylight. Their riders wore leather cuts emblazoned with a grinning skull wrapped in chains, the infamous colors of the Shadow Riders, a motorcycle gang known for causing trouble across 3 states. The Martinez family tensed, Mr. Martinez instinctively, pulling his children closer. Old Bill Cooper stirred from his nap, rheumy eyes widening at the commotion. Jenny stopped her wiping, dish towel clutched tightly in her young hands. David carefully closed his grade book, his movements deliberate and controlled. 20 years in the Marines had taught him to assess situations quickly, and everything about this one screamed trouble. The Shadow Riders had a reputation for violence, drug running and terrorizing small towns, unlucky enough to catch their attention. They weren't known for stopping at diners for peaceful meals. The bikes pulled into the parking lot, engines revving aggressively before cutting out. 8 riders dismounted, their movements unsteady from what was clearly a day of heavy drinking. Their leader, a massive man with a graying beard and arms covered in faded tattoos, stumbled slightly as he approached the diner's entrance. A crude patch on his cut identified him as Butcher. Sarah moved behind the counter, her face set in the determined expression of someone who'd weathered storms before. David remained seated, but his body subtly shifted into a state of readiness that any combat veteran would recognize. His eyes tracked exits, potential weapons, and positions of civilians, old habits that had kept him alive through 3 combat tours. The bell above the diner's door chimed pleasantly, a jarring contrast to the heavy boots that now crossed the threshold. The peaceful evening at Murphy's Diner was about to become anything but peaceful, and David Reeves was the only thing standing between these troublemakers and the innocent people trying to enjoy their dinner. Some nights start quietly and end in chaos. This would be one of them. The Shadow Riders swaggered into Murphy's Diner like they owned it, bringing with them the sharp smell of whiskey and leather. Their heavy boots scuffed against the freshly mopped floor as they spread out, taking up more space than necessary. The peaceful atmosphere shattered like fine china dropped on concrete. Butcher, their leader, stood at the entrance for a moment, bloodshot eyes scanning the diner with predatory intent. Behind him, his second-in-command, a younger man with a snake tattoo coiling up his neck and the name Viper stitched on his cut, smirked at Jenny, who quickly retreated behind the counter. The remaining riders, varying degrees of drunk and dangerous, positioned themselves around the diner in a way that David recognized as intentional. They were cutting off clear paths to the exits. "Well, well," Butcher's voice carried the gravelly tone of too many cigarettes and hard miles on the road. "Ain't this just the sweetest little setup?" He deliberately knocked over a stack of menus from the hostess station, the clatter making the Martinez children jump. "Real nice family place." "You got here." Sarah Murphy stepped forward, coffee pot still in hand, her voice steady despite the tension. "Welcome to Murphy's. If you gentlemen would like to take a seat, I'll have Jenny bring you some menus." The slight tremor in her hand betrayed her calm exterior, coffee rippling in the pot. Viper laughed, the sound sharp and unpleasant. "Here? Isn't that, boys? The lady thinks we're gentlemen." He swaggered toward the counter, deliberately bumping the table where the Martinez family sat. Their youngest daughter's crayon rolled onto the floor, and when Mr. Martinez moved to retrieve it, one of the bikers stepped on it, grinding it into the linoleum with his boot. David remained motionless in his booth, but his awareness had shifted into the hyper-alert state he knew so well from combat. He catalogued details automatically. 8 riders, all armed with at least knives based on the bulges in their clothes, 2 possibly carrying concealed firearms judging by their movements. Most were drunk enough to be slow, but that also made them unpredictable. "Coffee's fresh," Sarah continued, her voice remarkably steady, "or our kitchen's still open if you're hungry." She was trying to establish normalcy, to diffuse the situation through routine and politeness. David admired her courage, but he could see in Butcher's eyes that it wouldn't work. "Oh, we're hungry all right," Butcher growled, moving closer to the counter. His massive frame towered over Sarah. "Hungry for some real entertainment. This town's been too quiet lately." He reached out and grabbed the coffee pot from Sarah's hands, examining it with exaggerated interest before deliberately dropping it. Pot shattered on the floor, hot coffee and glass spreading across the clean linoleum. Sarah stepped back, her shoes crunching on broken glass. Jenny let out a small gasp, and old Bill Cooper started to rise from his booth, his face reddening with anger. "Stay seated, old-timer," one of the younger riders warned, moving to loom over Bill's booth. "This ain't your business." David watched as Butcher's men spread out further, their practiced movements suggesting this wasn't their first time intimidating. A small business. Two riders positioned themselves near the Martinez family, making comments in Spanish that caused Mrs. Martinez to pull her children closer, her face pale with anger and fear. "Actually," Butcher announced, his voice carrying through the diner, "I'm thinking this place needs new management. Been a while since we had a proper base in these mountains." He ran a finger along the clean counter, leaving a greasy smudge. "Might be time to expand our territory." Sarah stood her ground, though David could see her hands trembling slightly. "This diner's been in my family for 3 generations. Your husband ain't here, is he?" Butcher cut her off, leaning over the counter. "Way I hear it, ain't been here for a long time. Vietnam, wasn't it?" His mock sympathy carried an edge of cruelty. "Real shame. Probably why this place has gone so soft," the other riders laughed, the sound echoing off the diner's windows. Outside, the mountain twilight had deepened, and David could see curious locals gathering across the street, drawn by the commotion, but keeping their distance. A few had phones out, presumably calling the police. But Pine Ridge's small sheriff's department was at least 15 minutes away. "Think about it," Butcher continued, spreading his arms wide. "Shadow Rider's mountain chapter has a nice ring to it. We'll even let you keep working here, serving our boys." His gaze turned predatory. "That pretty little waitress, too." Jenny retreated further behind the counter, bumping into the coffee machine. The fear in her eyes sparked something in David, the same protective instinct that had driven him through 3 tours of combat. He remained still, watching, waiting. Years of experience had taught him to choose his moment carefully. The Martinez children were crying now, quiet, frightened sobs that their parents tried to hush. One of the bikers knocked their plates off the table, sending spaghetti and meatballs splattering across the floor. Mr. Martinez started to stand, but his wife grabbed his arm, recognizing the dangerous glint in the biker's eyes. "First thing tomorrow," Butcher declared, running his hand along the counter's edge, "we'll start making some proper changes. New management means new rules." He turned to survey the diner's terrified customers, clearly enjoying the fear he inspired. "Anyone got a problem with that?" The silence that followed was heavy with tension. Old Bill Cooper stared at his coffee cup, his hands trembling with suppressed rage. The Martinez family huddled together, their dinner ruined, but their focus entirely on protecting their children. Jenny had backed up against the kitchen door, and Sarah Murphy stood rigid, watching her family's legacy being threatened by thugs who mistook kindness for weakness. David took a slow sip of his cooling coffee, his mind already calculating angles, distances, and potential scenarios. He'd faced worse odds in worse places, but there were civilians to consider here. Whatever happened next would have to be handled carefully. The Shadow Riders had chosen to make their stand in Murphy's diner, unaware that they'd just challenged a man who'd spent his entire adult life defending others from exactly their kind of brutality. The sound of coffee dripping from a broken pot suddenly seemed thunderous in the tense silence of Murphy's diner. Butcher turned slowly, his bleary eyes scanning the room for any sign of defiance. That's when he noticed something odd. One customer hadn't moved. In the booth by the window, David Reeves continued grading papers as if 8 drunk bikers hadn't just threatened to take over the diner. "Hey, Professor," Butcher called out, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "Think you might want to pay attention when new management's talking." He nodded to Viper, who swaggered over to David's booth, combat boots leaving dirty tracks across the clean floor. David carefully marked the last grade on Tommy Martinez's paper, an A The kid had really shown improvement before looking up. His movements were unhurried, deliberate, the kind of calm that comes from having faced far worse situations. "I heard you," he replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded Marines in combat. "I just don't think you've thought this through." Viper reached the booth first, planting both hands on David's table and leaning forward. A cheap silver chain around his neck swung forward, catching the diner's fluorescent lights. "Oh yeah?" he sneered. "What's there to think through, old man? Looks pretty simple to me." David met Viper's gaze steadily. This close, he could smell the whiskey on the younger man's breath, see the dilated pupils that suggested more than just alcohol in his system. "Simple isn't always smart," David replied, carefully stacking his student's papers and sliding them into his briefcase. "And right now, you gentlemen are making a series of increasingly poor decisions." Butcher's laugh boomed through the diner, but there was an edge of anger in it now. He moved toward David's booth, his size making the diner feel smaller. "Poor decisions? Brother, I don't think you understand how this works. We're not asking permission. We're telling you how things are going to be." "Actually," David said, still, seated but now fully focused on the approaching threat, "I understand exactly how this works. You ride into small towns, target family businesses, use intimidation and violence to establish control. It's a pattern. Predictable. Unimaginative." His voice carried no fear, only a clinical assessment that seemed to further anger the bikers. Viper straightened up, his hand moving to the back of his belt, where David had already noted the bulge of a concealed knife. "You got a big mouth for a school teacher," he snarled. "Maybe we should start our new management by teaching you some respect." The Martinez family watched wide-eyed as the confrontation unfolded. Mr. Martinez recognized something in David's demeanor, the controlled readiness, the careful positioning. He quietly began moving his family toward the kitchen door, drawing. "No attention, but prepared to get them to safety. Respect," David repeated thoughtfully, as if discussing the concept with his history class. "Interesting choice of words. In my experience, those who demand respect through force rarely deserve it." He remained seated, but his posture had subtly shifted. Any trained fighter would have recognized the change. Weight balanced, hands relaxed but ready, eyes constantly tracking multiple threats. Butcher reached the booth, looming over David. His massive frame cast a shadow across the table, an attempt at intimidation that had probably worked countless times before. "Your experience," he mocked. "What experience would that be, Teach? Grading papers, telling kids about history?" Sarah Murphy, still behind the counter, noticed something then. The way David's scarred hands rested on the table, the practiced stillness of a predator waiting to strike. She'd seen that look before, in her late husband's eyes when he spoke of Vietnam. This wasn't just a teacher about to be roughed up by bikers. This was something else entirely. "Among other things," David replied calmly, "I also spent some time in the Marines, Force Recon, 20 years of experience dealing with individuals who mistake violence for strength." He delivered this information not as a threat or a boast, but as a simple statement of fact. The shift in the room was subtle, but immediate. Two of the younger riders exchanged glances, their bravado wavering slightly. Even Viper took half a step. Back though he quickly caught himself, but Butcher, either too drunk or too arrogant to recognize the warning signs, only laughed harder. "A Marine?" he sneered, reaching down to grab David's coffee cup. "Well, ain't that special? Tell me, Jarhead, you think being a has-been tough guy means anything here?" He deliberately poured what remained of the coffee onto David's stack of graded papers, the brown liquid seeping into the edges of his student's hard work. David watched. The coffee spread across his student's essays, his expression unchanging. Those papers represent hours of work from kids who are trying to learn, to better themselves. His voice remained steady, but now carried an edge that made Sarah Murphy step back from the counter. They deserve more respect than you're showing. Yeah? Butcher leaned in closer, his breath hot and sour. What you gonna do about it, Teach? Gonna give us detention? The other riders laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it now. Something in David's continued calm was setting off warning bells that their alcohol-soaked minds couldn't quite process. David finally stood, his movement so smooth and controlled that Butcher unconsciously took a step back. Though not as physically imposing as the biker, David carried himself with the kind of presence that commanded attention. "I'm going to give you one chance," he said quietly. "Take your men, get on your bikes, and leave this town. Consider it a free lesson in good decision-making." The diner had gone completely silent. Even the Martinez children had stopped crying. Sensing the change in the atmosphere, old Bill Cooper sat forward in his booth, his weathered hands gripping his coffee cup tightly. Jenny had stopped retreating, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of fear and hope. Butcher's face darkened with rage. Nobody talked to him like this, especially not in front of his men. "Wrong answer, Teach," he growled, reaching for David's collar. "Time to show you what happens to people who don't respect the Shadow Riders." What happened next would be talked about in Pine Ridge for years to come. Butcher's meaty hand never reached David's collar. In a movement too smooth and swift for most observers to follow, David shifted slightly to his left, his right hand coming up to catch Butcher's wrist in a grip that made the larger man's eyes widen in surprise. Before anyone could react, David had redirected Butcher's momentum, using the biker's own weight and forward motion against him. The gang leader's face met the diner table with enough force to rattle the silverware. "First mistake," David said, calmly, maintaining his hold on Butcher's wrist while the big man tried to process what had just happened. "Telegraphing your attack." Viper reached for the knife at his back, but David had already anticipated this. Still controlling Butcher with one hand, he swept his briefcase off the table in a fluid arc that caught Viper in the face. The heavy case, loaded with student papers and textbooks, sent the younger biker staggering backward into his companions. "Second mistake," David continued, his voice maintaining that same instructor's tone he used in class. "Poor situational awareness." The remaining bikers stood frozen for a moment, shocked by the sudden reversal. They'd seen plenty of fights, started most of them, but this was different. This wasn't the chaos of a bar brawl or the crude violence of gang warfare. This was something else entirely: precise, controlled, professional. Butcher tried to push himself up from the table, his face red with rage and humiliation. David adjusted his grip slightly, applying pressure to specific nerve points that made the larger man gasp in pain. 2 decades of hand-to-hand combat training had taught David exactly how much force to use, enough to control, not enough to cause permanent damage. Yet, "Let him go," one of the younger riders shouted, pulling a switchblade from his pocket. The distinctive click of the blade opening seemed to break the spell of shock that had fallen over the diner. 3 more bikers moved forward, weapons appearing. In their hands, David assessed the situation with the calm efficiency that had kept him alive through countless combat operations. 4 immediate threats advancing, 2 more by the door starting to move in. Butcher still controlled, but trying to resist. Civilians to protect. The Martinez family still by their table. Old Bill in his booth. Sarah and Jenny behind the counter. "Mrs. Murphy," David called out, his voice carrying the clear command presence that had once directed Marine units in combat. "Would you please take everyone into the kitchen?" It wasn't really a request, and Sarah Murphy recognized the tone. She quickly began ushering the Martinez family toward the kitchen door, gesturing for Jenny to follow. "You're dead, Teach," Butcher growled through gritted teeth, still struggling against David's hold. "You have no idea what you just started." "Actually," David replied, scanning the approaching threats, "I know exactly what I'm doing. Just like I know about your operations in Carson City last month. The shopkeeper who accidentally fell down his own stairs. The convenience store that mysteriously caught fire. He felt Butcher tense at these mentions. See, some of us pay attention to patterns. Some of us notice when garbage starts spilling into our communities. The approaching bikers hesitated slightly at this revelation. David used their moment of uncertainty to make his next move. In one fluid motion, he pulled Butcher upright, spun him around, and sent him stumbling into his advancing companions. The tangle of leather and limbs bought him the seconds he needed to create space, positioning himself between the bikers and the kitchen door where the civilians had retreated. "You've been working your way through the mountain towns," David continued, his stance relaxed but ready, starting with the smaller ones, places with minimal law enforcement, building up to bigger targets. His eyes tracked each biker's movement, noting their positions, their level of intoxication, their fighting stances, or lack thereof. "But you've gotten sloppy, overconfident." Through the kitchen door window, David could see Sarah Murphy on the phone, probably with Sheriff Thompson, though the local police were still at least 10 minutes away. He needed to control the situation until then, preferably without anyone getting killed. Sloppy? Viper had recovered from the briefcase to the face, blood trickling from his nose. "8 of us, 1 of you. Those odds ain't sloppy, Jarhead." He spat the last word like an insult, but his hand shook slightly as he pointed his knife toward David. 8 untrained, drunk individuals who rely on numbers and intimidation, David corrected, his teacher's tone carrying a sharp edge now, against someone who spent 20 years training specifically to handle multiple hostile combatants. The odds aren't in your favor. Butcher had regained his feet, his face a mask of fury. "Take him!" he commanded, his voice thick with rage and humiliation. "Take him hard!" The bikers moved in, but their coordinated attack fell apart almost immediately. David moved like water, flowing between their wild swings and clumsy grabs. Each movement was economical, precise, the product of thousands of hours of training and real-world experience. He didn't attack so much as redirect, using their own momentum and poor balance against them. One biker went down clutching his knee, another doubled over struggling to breathe. Viper's knife clattered across the floor after a wrist lock that made him scream. David maintained his position protecting the kitchen door, never moving further than necessary, every action calculated and controlled. Through the window, curious, townspeople had gathered to watch the commotion. Someone was filming with their phone. In the kitchen, the Martinez children watched through the small window with a mixture of fear and awe as their history teacher moved like something out of an action movie. But what the observers couldn't see, what only another combat veteran might recognize, was that David was holding back significantly. These weren't enemy combatants to be eliminated, they were criminals to be contained. Every move was designed to disable without causing permanent injury, to control without killing. He'd seen enough death in his career, more than enough for several lifetimes. Before we continue this intense confrontation at Murphy's Diner, tell us where in the world you're watching from. If you're enjoying this story of justice being served, make sure to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's video about a corrupt small-town mayor picking a fight with the wrong military veteran will absolutely blow your mind. Now back to Pine Ridge, where a group of drunk bikers are learning a painful lesson about judging books by their covers. Another biker hit the floor hard, his attempt at a wild haymaker redirected into empty air by David's precise movement. The remaining Shadow Riders spread out, creating a loose semicircle around their target. Their earlier drunken confidence had evaporated, replaced by a growing realization that they'd severely underestimated their opponent. "You're making this worse for yourselves," David advised, maintaining his defensive stance between the bikers and the kitchen door. His breathing remained steady, controlled, showing no signs of exertion. "Whatever happens next, you've already lost. The town's watching. Phones are recording. Your usual tactics of intimidation won't work here anymore." Through the diner's windows, the crowd of onlookers had grown larger. Word spread quickly in small towns, and the sight of the notorious shadow riders being systematically dismantled by a high school history teacher was drawing quite an audience. Several phones were out, capturing every moment. Butcher wiped blood from his nose, his earlier arrogance replaced by cold fury. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, Jarhead," he snarled. "The Shadow Riders ain't just some local gang. We got connections, people who make problems disappear." David's slight smile didn't reach his eyes. "Interesting choice of words," he replied, "because I used to be one of the people governments called when they needed problems to disappear." His voice dropped lower, meant only for the bikers to hear. Force Recon wasn't just a unit. It was a clearinghouse for special operations that never made the headlines. Something in his tone made two of the younger riders exchange nervous glances. Even Viper, still nursing his injured wrist, took another step back. They'd threatened plenty of people before, but this was different. The calm in David's voice, the controlled precision of his movements, the way he seemed to anticipate their every action, it all spoke of experience far beyond what they'd encountered before. "You think this ends here?" Butcher demanded, though he made no move to attack again. "This is our territory now. Even if you walk out of here tonight, we'll be back. And next time—" "Next time what?" David interrupted, his tone sharpening. "Next time you'll bring more men, better weapons. Let me explain something about territory." He shifted his weight slightly, causing the entire group of bikers to tense. "In Force Recon, we specialized in denied area operations, infiltration, exfiltration, tactical intervention in hostile territory, the kind of missions that required us to deal with forces that significantly outnumbered us." As if to emphasize his point, David suddenly moved, not to attack but simply to adjust his position. The speed and fluidity of the movement made several bikers flinch backward. Their reactions told him everything he needed to know about their actual combat experience. "But what made us effective wasn't just our training," he continued. "It was our network, intelligence, support, the understanding that we never operated truly alone." His eyes met Butcher's directly. "Just like I'm not alone now." On cue, the diner's door chimed. A tall figure stepped inside, wearing a sheriff's deputy uniform. Ryan Cooper, Old Bill's grandson and a former Army Ranger, surveyed the scene with professional interest. "Everything all right in here, Mr. Reeves?" he asked, though his hand rested casually on his sidearm. "Just having a discussion about territory and poor life choices, Deputy," David replied, never taking his eyes off the bikers. "Though I think our guests were just leaving." More vehicles could be heard approaching outside. Police cruisers. Based on the sound of their engines, the Shadow Riders found themselves in an unfamiliar position, outmaneuvered and running out of options. "Thing about small towns," David continued, his teacher's tone returning. "We look out for each other. That network I mentioned, it doesn't just include active duty personnel. Veterans settle all over the country. Some become teachers, some become police officers, some run businesses, and we stay in touch." Through the kitchen door window, the Martinez family watched as David Reeves, the quiet history teacher who helped their son improve his grades, systematically dismantled a notorious biker gang without throwing a single punch. In his controlled movements and careful positioning, they saw glimpses of the warrior he'd been, still ready to protect those who needed protection. "So here's what happens next," David announced, his voice carrying that command presence again. "You're going to leave Pine Ridge tonight. If you come back, if you try to retaliate against anyone in this town, a lot of people are going to take a sudden interest in your operations. People with badges, people with federal authority, people who specialize in making problems disappear." More police cruisers pulled up outside, their lights painting the diner's interior in rotating reds and blues. The Shadow Rider's once intimidating presence had been reduced to a group of battered, uncertain men, weighing their dwindling options. But Butcher, his face darkened by rage and humiliation, wasn't ready to accept defeat. His hand strayed to his belt, where David had already noted the bulge of a concealed handgun. The gang leader's eyes held the dangerous look of someone about to make a very poor decision. "This ain't over," Butcher growled, his fingers inching closer to his weapon. "Not by a long shot." David's stance shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, but in a way that made Deputy Cooper tense and reach for his own sidearm. The next few seconds would determine whether this confrontation ended with arrests or ambulances. Time seemed to slow in Murphy's diner as Butcher's fingers crept toward his concealed weapon. David's combat-trained mind calculated angles, distances, and potential casualties with cold precision. 3 civilians still in the main dining area, others in the kitchen, Deputy Cooper in the doorway, gathering crowd outside. Too many potential targets if bullets started flying. "I wouldn't," David said quietly, his voice carrying that special kind of authority that makes people listen. "You draw that weapon, and things escalate to a level you're not prepared for." His eyes never left Butcher's face, but his peripheral vision tracked every movement in the room. "Think about it. Really think. Right now you're looking at simple assault charges, maybe criminal threatening. The moment that gun clears your belt, everything changes." Deputy Cooper had drawn his sidearm, but kept it pointed at the floor, maintaining trigger discipline while positioning himself for a better angle. Outside, more law enforcement vehicles were arriving, the sound of their sirens mixing with the murmur of the growing crowd. "Listen to him, Butcher," Viper called out, surprising everyone. The younger biker was still nursing his injured wrist, but his voice carried a note of desperate reason. "This ain't worth dying over. We got operations in 3 states. Business, arrangements, partners who expect returns. We start a shootout here, all that falls apart." But Butcher's face had taken on that particular look that David had seen too many times in combat. The expression of a man so consumed by pride and rage that reason no longer reached him. The gang leader's fingers wrapped around his pistol. "A grip. You think you got this all figured out, don't you, Teach?" Butcher snarled. "Think you can just walk in here, embarrass the Shadow Riders, and everything goes back to normal?" His knuckles whitened on the weapon. Sometimes normal needs to be broken. Sometimes examples need to be made. David's posture shifted slightly, a change so subtle that only Deputy Cooper, with his military background, recognized it for what it was. The former Force Recon Marine was preparing to move, to act, to engage a lethal threat with lethal force if necessary. "Last chance," David warned, his voice dropping to that special register that combat veterans develop. The tone that says the next move is permanent. "Take your hand off the weapon. Walk out of here. Live to make better decisions tomorrow." Through the kitchen door window, Sarah Murphy watched the scene unfold with growing horror. She'd seen that look before, in her late husband's eyes when he spoke of particularly bad days in Vietnam. It was the look of a man preparing to do whatever necessary to protect others. Old Bill Cooper, still in his booth, slowly began to slide down beneath his table. His movement caught Butcher's attention for a split second, and that's when everything exploded into action. Butcher drew his weapon, but David was already moving. Years of combat training took over, his body responding with practiced precision before his conscious mind fully engaged. He crossed the distance between them in 2 fluid steps, his left hand deflecting the rising gun, while his right delivered a precise strike to Butcher's brachial plexus. The gang leader's fingers went numb, the pistol clattering to the floor unfired. But David wasn't finished. In the same smooth motion, he trapped Butcher's arm, used the bigger man's momentum to spin him around, and drove him face first into the diner's counter with enough force to crack the laminate surface. "Everybody down," Deputy Cooper shouted, his weapon now raised and covering the remaining bikers. "Hands where I can see them!" The other Shadow Riders, already demoralized by watching their leader's repeated humiliation, began dropping to their knees, raising their hands. Through the windows, they could see more deputies taking up positions, weapons drawn. But Butcher wasn't finished. Despite being pinned to the counter, despite his arm being locked in a hold that sent waves of pain through his shoulder, the gang leader started laughing. A harsh, dangerous sound that made David's combat instincts spike with warning. "You really should have done your homework, Jarhead," Butcher gasped through his pain. "Should have asked yourself why we chose this town, why tonight." His laugh turned into a wheezing cough. "The Shadow Riders ain't just some local gang. We got friends, connected friends. And right about now, they're hitting the Pine Ridge First National Bank." David maintained his hold, but felt his stomach tighten. The bank was just 2 blocks away, and with most of the town's small police force here at the diner. As if on cue, a distant explosion rocked the night air. Car alarms began wailing in the direction of the town square. Deputy Cooper's radio crackled to life with panicked voices reporting multiple armed suspects at the bank. "That's right," Butcher continued, his voice strained but triumphant. "We're just the distraction, the B team, while everyone's watching us." He let the implication hang in the air. David's mind raced through scenarios, calculations, options. The bank was next door to the library, where evening reading programs would still be in session. The blast would have come from the bank's rear wall, where it backed up against the town park. At this hour, there would still be people out walking, kids on the playground. "Cooper," David called out, his voice shifting fully into command mode. "How many deputies responded here?" 4 units, the deputy replied, still covering the other bikers. "Basically the entire night shift." Another explosion rattled the windows, followed by the distinctive sound of automatic weapons fire. The crowd outside the diner began to scatter as more sirens filled the air. "You don't know what you stumbled into, Teach," Butcher wheezed. "This ain't just about some small-town diner anymore. This is big business, professional players, the kind of people who don't leave witnesses." David's grip tightened slightly, causing Butcher to gasp in pain. "You're right about one thing," he said quietly. "This isn't just about the diner anymore, but you've made a serious mistake." His voice hardened. "You brought your war to my town. Tonight, you learn why that was a very poor decision." David maintained his hold on Butcher while reaching into his pocket with his free hand, retrieving a phone that didn't look like any civilian model. His fingers moved across the screen in a precise pattern, entering codes that would have seemed random to observers, but were anything but. "Sierra 2 Delta." He spoke into the phone, his voice carrying the clipped precision of a combat radio. "Operator. Authorization code Romeo Echo 97. Immediate response requested." He paused, listening to a reply only he could hear. "Affirmative. Multiple hostiles, automatic weapons, civilian presence. Bank location compromised. Response. Team needed." Butcher's laughter died in his throat as he recognized military communication protocols. This wasn't just some ex-Marine turned teacher. This was something else entirely. "What's happening?" Deputy Cooper asked, still covering the other bikers, but glancing nervously toward the sounds of combat from the direction of the bank. "Remember how I mentioned networks?" David replied, his voice calm despite the chaos erupting outside. "In about 3 minutes, your jurisdiction is going to get a little crowded." His phone chirped with an incoming message. "Make that 2 minutes." The distant sound of helicopters began to fill the air, not the civilian choppers that occasionally flew medical transport to the regional hospital, but the distinctive thrum of military aircraft moving fast and low. "You're bluffing," Butcher growled, but the tremor in his voice betrayed his uncertainty. "This is a local operation, small-town cops and retired jarheads. You can't just call in the cavalry." David's slight smile didn't reach his eyes. Force. Recon wasn't just a unit, he explained, his voice taking on that teacher's tone again. It was a gateway to other programs, more specialized operations, the kind that don't officially exist. He adjusted his hold slightly, causing Butcher to wince, and retirement is a relative term. Through the diner's windows, they could see black SUVs rolling into town from multiple directions, moving with the coordinated precision of a well-planned operation. Men in tactical gear began deploying, their movements suggesting the kind of training that went far beyond basic law enforcement. "Cooper," David called out, "you're about to have some federal visitors. When they arrive, tell them Phantom sends his regards. They'll understand." The deputy's eyes widened slightly at the codename. Even Viper, still kneeling with his hands raised, sucked in a sharp breath. The name Phantom carried weight in certain circles, a legend among special operations communities, known for missions that became classified briefing room tales. "You?" Butcher's voice cracked slightly. "You're the Phantom?" "The thing about retiring to a small town," David continued, as if giving a history lesson, "is that it gives you perspective, lets you see patterns, like how a motorcycle gang suddenly starts moving through mountain communities with military precision, how their operations show signs of professional planning, almost like they had expert advice." Another explosion rocked the night, but this one was different. Controlled, precise, the sound of breaching charges being deployed by professionals. The automatic weapons fire at the bank was now being answered by the distinctive report of military-grade weapons. "Your connected friends at the bank," David said quietly. "Former special forces, right? Probably worked private security overseas. Got hired by someone with deep pockets and bigger plans." He felt Butcher tense at the accuracy of his assessment. "Did they tell you who they really work for? What this is really about?" Before Butcher could respond, the diner's door opened. Two men in tactical gear entered, their weapons at the ready, but pointed down. The patches on their gear bore no unit insignia, no agency identification. "Room secure," one of them reported into his radio. Then, noticing David, "Phantom, sir. Command sends their regards. Area is contained. HVTs at the bank location are being addressed." David nodded. "Casualties?" "Negative on civilian casualties. 2 deputies wounded, non-critical. Tangos at the bank location showed resistance. Response was appropriate." The sound of gunfire had stopped completely now. In its place came the controlled chaos of a professional operation wrapping up, commands being shouted, vehicles moving into position, the thrum of helicopters maintaining oversight. "Your professional players just learned an important lesson," David told Butcher. "There's always someone better trained, better equipped, and better connected. The only question is—" He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for the gang leaders' ears. "Who hired them? Who pointed the Shadow Riders toward specific towns, specific banks? Because this isn't about money laundering or territory expansion. This is about something bigger." Butcher's face had gone pale. "I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, but his eyes darted toward his discarded phone on the floor. A tell that David immediately caught. "Cooper," David called out, "would you secure that phone? Carefully. I believe it contains some very interesting communications." More tactical teams were arriving now. Through the windows they could see the Shadow Riders' bikes being loaded onto unmarked trucks. This wasn't a simple police operation anymore. This was a federal response to something much larger. "See, tonight wasn't just about protecting a diner," David continued. "You helped us confirm a pattern we've been tracking. Small gangs suddenly getting sophisticated, local criminals showing signs of professional training. Someone's been building a network, using groups like the Shadow Riders as cover for something bigger. Tonight, they showed their hand." The tactical team leader approached, his posture respectful. "Sir, Command wants to know if you'll be conducting the initial interrogation." David looked down at Butcher, who had finally stopped struggling. "I think our friend here is ready to have a very detailed conversation about his organization's recent activities, particularly their choice of targets and training sources." The night air filled with the sound of professional operators securing the town, while in Murphy's diner, a high school history teacher prepared to step back into a world he'd thought he'd left behind. Sometimes retirement has to wait when duty calls. In a makeshift command center established in Pine Ridge's sheriff's office, David studied the contents of Butcher's phone displayed on multiple screens. The gang leader's device had proven to be a treasure trove of information, revealing a conspiracy far more sophisticated than a simple motorcycle gang's criminal activities. "Look at these communications," Agent Sarah Chen said, pointing to encrypted messages that her team had decrypted. Unlike the other federal operators, she wore civilian clothes, her badge discreetly clipped to her belt. The Shadow Riders were receiving detailed intelligence, patrol schedules, security system specifications, architectural blueprints. "This isn't the kind of information street criminals have access to." David nodded, his eyes scanning the data with the practiced efficiency of someone used to finding patterns in chaos. "The bank wasn't the real target, was it?" "No," Chen confirmed, pulling up a map of the region. Red dots indicated locations of recent Shadow Riders activities, forming a pattern that only became clear when viewed from above. "They've been systematically hitting small mountain towns, but not randomly. Look at the sequence." David studied the pattern, his expression darkening as he recognized what he was seeing. "They're creating corridors, secure routes through the mountains, away from major highways and surveillance systems." "Exactly." Chen brought up another screen showing shipping manifests. "We think someone's using gangs like the Shadow Riders to establish a new smuggling network, but it's not drugs or weapons, at least not primarily. They're moving something else, something that requires specialized handling." The command center buzzed with activity as more information poured in from various agencies. The tactical teams that had responded to David's call had uncovered more than just bank robbers. The Shadow Riders' attempted heist had been a cover for something far more concerning. "The bank's vault," David mused, thinking out loud. "They weren't after the money. They were accessing something stored there." "Safe deposit boxes," Chen confirmed. "Specifically, box number 447, registered to a shell company that traces back to some very interesting names." She lowered her voice. "Names that appear in classified briefings about emerging technological threats." Deputy Cooper entered the room, his uniform dusty from helping secure the scene at the bank. "Mr. Reeves," he reported, "we found something you need to see. In the bank's basement below the vault level, they had some kind of scanning equipment set up." David exchanged glances with Agent Chen. "Ground-penetrating radar?" "Yes, sir. And something else. Equipment even our tech guys don't recognize. All branded with this symbol." Cooper handed over a photograph showing a corporate logo, a stylized phoenix rising from what appeared to be binary code. "Phoenix Horizon," Chen said grimly. "They're a legitimate tech company on paper, specializing in quantum computing and advanced materials research, but we've been tracking their less public activities for months. They've been particularly interested in certain geological formations in the Rocky Mountains." The pieces were starting to come together in David's mind. The Shadow Riders' targeting pattern. They weren't just creating smuggling routes. They were conducting a survey, using criminal activities as cover for a systematic search of the region. But searching for what? Hooper asked, looking bewildered by the scope of what had started as a simple confrontation in a diner. Before anyone could respond, one of the tactical team leaders burst into the command center. "Sir, we've got movement at the North Mining Complex. Multiple vehicles, heavy equipment. They're mobilizing fast, like they know we're onto them." David was already moving, reaching for the tactical gear that had been provided to him. Some skills never fade, and tonight had awakened muscle memories from years of covert operations. "Chen, how long until we can get air support?" 20 minutes for the nearest assets to divert, she replied, already on her secure phone. "But there's something else you need to know. The mining complex, it's not just an abandoned site. In the 1940s, it was a classified research facility. The records are still heavily redacted, but they were studying something they found in the deep shafts. Something that defied conventional physics." David checked his weapon, muscle memory taking over as he performed the familiar routine. "And now Phoenix Horizon thinks they've found it again, using local gangs to create distractions and provide cover while they searched. The Shadow Riders were just pawns," Chen confirmed, "expendable assets to keep law enforcement focused on typical criminal activities while the real operation proceeded unnoticed. Through the command center's windows, they could see more tactical teams deploying, their vehicles moving with urgent purpose through Pine Ridge's suddenly busy streets." The quiet mountain town had become the focal point of something far larger than a simple gang confrontation. "Cooper," David called out, "I need you to coordinate with local authorities. Keep the civilians clear of the mining complex. Whatever Phoenix Horizon is after, they're willing to use criminal organizations as cover and risk civilian casualties. That makes them desperate, and desperate people make mistakes." The deputy nodded, already reaching for his radio. Outside, the distinctive sound of military helicopters grew louder as additional assets arrived. Whatever was hidden in the old mining complex had attracted serious attention, and now Pine Ridge was at the center of a covert operation decades in the making. "One more thing," Chen added, her voice serious. "The quantum scanning equipment they were using at the bank. It registered some kind of energy signature, something strong enough to overwhelm their sensors. Whatever they're looking for, it's not just rare or valuable. It's potentially game-changing." David finished gearing up, his movements efficient and practiced. The quiet history teacher had fully given way to the special operations veteran, the man known in classified circles as Phantom. "Then we better make sure we find it first, because something tells me we don't want Phoenix Horizon weaponizing whatever's hidden in those mountains." The night that had started with a simple confrontation in Murphy's diner had evolved into something far more complex. As David led a team of operators toward the waiting vehicles, he couldn't help but appreciate the irony. He'd come to Pine Ridge looking for peace, for a quiet life, teaching history. Instead, he'd found himself at the center of a conspiracy that threatened to make history of its own. The convoy of unmarked vehicles moved silently through Pine Ridge's darkened streets, their headlights off, guided by night vision equipment. In the lead SUV, David studied satellite imagery of the mining complex displayed on a tactical tablet, while Agent Chen coordinated with various teams via secure communications. "Phoenix Horizon's personnel are primarily ex-military," Chen reported, her voice low, despite the vehicle's soundproofed interior. "Private security contractors, many with special operations backgrounds. They're well-equipped and well-trained." "But they're mercenaries," David replied, his eyes never leaving the tactical display. "Fighting for a paycheck, not a cause. That gives us an advantage." He zoomed in on the mining complex's main entrance. "What about their command structure?" Chen pulled up personnel files on her secure laptop. "On-site commander is Marcus Vale, former Delta Force. He went private sector after Afghanistan, started taking contracts that raised red flags with intelligence communities. Real zealot type, believes technological superiority justifies any means necessary." The convoy turned onto the old mining road, their specialized tires handling the rough terrain with minimal noise. Through night vision goggles, David could see the mountain looming ahead, its abandoned mining structures creating jagged silhouettes against the star-filled sky. Update from the surveillance drone. one of the tactical operators reported from the back seat. "Heavy equipment moving into the main shaft. They're setting up some kind of drilling platform, but it's not standard mining gear." David's mind flashed back to the quantum scanning equipment found at the bank. They found what they were looking for. Now they're moving to extract it before we can stop them. He turned to Chen. What exactly did they detect in those deep shafts? What was so important that it warranted using criminal gangs as cover for a systematic survey of the entire region? Chen hesitated, then accessed a classified file on her laptop. In 1947, this wasn't just a mining operation. It was a research facility studying unusual phenomena. The original miners broke through into something, a chamber that shouldn't have existed at that depth. Inside, they found artifacts that exhibited properties that violated known physics. Like what? Materials that seemed to generate energy without any known power source. Alloys that could alter their molecular structure in response to specific frequencies. The kind of technology that could revolutionize everything from energy production to weapons development. Chen's expression was grim. The program was shut down after an accident that was never fully explained in the declassified records. The convoy came to a stop in a concealed position half a mile from the mining complex. Through their night vision equipment, they could see activity around the main entrance. Armed personnel establishing defensive positions, heavy equipment being moved into place. "Sierra team in position," a voice reported through their tactical comms. "Multiple hostiles identified. They've got the entrance heavily fortified and—" Wait. There was a pause. "Sir, you need to see this. They're using some kind of energy shielding technology. Nothing we've encountered before." David shared a look with Chen. "They've already retrieved samples. They're not just looking for artifacts. They're already implementing the technology." The tactical teams began deploying, their movements silent and coordinated. Years of training and experience showed in every precise action as they established a perimeter around the mining complex. But this wasn't a standard operation. They were facing an enemy using technology that shouldn't exist. "Additional vehicles approaching from the north," another operator reported. "High-end tactical gear, probably Phoenix Horizon reinforcements. They're bringing in some kind of specialized containment equipment." David watched through his tactical scope as more mercenaries arrived, their movements betraying high-level military training. But something about their operations seemed off, too urgent, too rushed. They were racing against something. "They're scared," he realized, lowering his scope. "Look at their deployment pattern. They're not just securing the site. They're preparing for immediate extraction. Whatever's down there, it's not stable. They need to move it now." Chen's phone buzzed with an encrypted message. Her face paled slightly as she read it. "Energy readings from the deep shaft are spiking. Similar signatures are being detected at other locations across the region, places where the Shadow Riders conducted their surveys. It's like something's waking up." The night air seemed to vibrate with an energy that had nothing to do with the equipment being moved into the mine. David could feel it, a subtle resonance that made his combat-honed instincts scream warnings. "All teams, maintain position," he commanded through the tactical net. "We're not just stopping a theft, we're preventing something potentially catastrophic." He turned to Chen. "If Phoenix Horizon removes whatever they found from its containment, if they try to transport it, it could destabilize the entire region," she finished. "The original research notes warned about moving the artifacts. They said the technology wasn't just advanced, it was interconnected, part of a larger system that spread throughout the mountain range." The tactical teams finished their deployment, awaiting orders. In the distance, the mining complex hummed with activity as Phoenix Horizon's personnel rushed to extract their prize. But David's attention was drawn to something else, a subtle vibration in the ground, a feeling of building pressure that reminded him of moments before an artillery strike. "Time's up," he announced, checking his weapon one final time. "Whatever's happening down there, whatever they've awakened, we need to contain it now. Because I have a feeling that technology isn't the only thing that's been sleeping in those mountains." The night erupted into chaos as David's teams executed their coordinated assault on the mining complex. Phoenix Horizon's advanced technology proved formidable. Energy shields flickered against conventional weapons, and their mercenaries wielded equipment that seemed pulled from science fiction. But they hadn't counted on facing operators of equal or superior training, led by someone legendary, even among special forces. "Sierra team, breach and clear the north entrance," David commanded, his voice calm despite the firefight erupting around him. "Echo team, suppress their defensive positions. Watch for energy shield deployments and adjust your targeting accordingly." The mercenaries' technical advantages were impressive, but David's experience taught him that every advanced system had vulnerabilities. The energy shields couldn't cover every angle, and their power sources could be overwhelmed by concentrated fire. "They're falling back to the main shaft," Chen reported, monitoring tactical feeds from their command position. "Vale's with them. He's supervising the loading of some kind of containment unit onto their transport vehicle." David moved with his strike team through the chaos, his movements precise and efficient. Years of combat experience guided every decision, every action. The mercenaries were good, but they were fighting for a paycheck. His teams were fighting to prevent a catastrophe. "Contact!" a voice crackled through the tactical net. "Vale's deploying some kind of... Christ, what is that?" Through his tactical scope, David saw Marcus Vale activate a device that emitted waves of distorting energy, creating ripples in the very air. Several operators stumbled, their equipment malfunctioning as the unknown technology interfered with their systems. "Hold positions," David commanded, recognizing the pattern. "They're desperate. Desperate means sloppy." He keyed his radio to address Vale directly. "You don't know what you're dealing with, Marcus. That technology wasn't meant to be moved. The original research team learned that the hard way." Vale's laugh carried across the battlefield. "The Phantom himself. I should have known you'd be involved." The mercenary commander stood confidently behind his energy shield, the containment unit humming ominously behind him. "You don't get it, do you? This technology is going to change everything. Whoever controls it controls the future." But David had noticed something Vale hadn't. The increasing vibration in the ground, the way the energy signatures were building towards something. The technology wasn't just active, it was responding to being removed from its resting place. "Sierra team, status." David called out while maneuvering his strike team into position. "Sir, we've breached the north entrance, but there's something happening in the deep shaft. Energy readings are off the charts and, sir, we're getting structural warnings. The whole complex is becoming unstable." Vale must have received similar reports because his next orders carried an edge of panic. "Load that containment unit now. We're moving out in 3 minutes, no matter what." That's when David saw their opportunity. In their rush to evacuate, Phoenix Horizon's mercenaries had created gaps in their defensive coverage. More importantly, their energy shields were showing signs of strain from maintaining extended coverage. "All teams, execute Pattern Sierra 9. David commanded. It was a tactic he'd developed years ago for overwhelming technologically superior opponents. Coordinated strikes from multiple angles, forcing them to spread their defensive capabilities too thin. The night lit up as David's operators launched their synchronized assault. Concentrated fire overwhelmed energy shields at critical points. Precision breaching charges detonated at exactly the right moments to create chain reactions in Phoenix Horizon's defensive systems. Vale's confident expression finally cracked as his forces began to crumble. "No, you don't understand what's at stake. This technology could revolutionize everything." "You're right about one thing," David replied, advancing with his team as the mercenaries' defenses failed. "I do understand what's at stake. That's why we can't let you leave with it." The containment unit's hum had risen to a dangerous pitch. Energy readings were spiking across all frequencies. Whatever they'd awakened in the mountain depths was responding to their attempts to move it, and not in a way anyone had anticipated. "Last chance, Marcus," David called out as his team secured decisive positions around the mining complex. "Shut it down, or what happens next is on you." The confrontation at the mining complex ended dramatically when Vale, realizing he'd lost control of both the situation and the technology, attempted one final desperate move. The containment unit's overload forced David to make a split-second decision, one that saved lives but ensured the mysterious technology would remain safely buried in the mountain's depths. In the aftermath, Pine Ridge gradually returned to normal. The Shadow Riders were dismantled, their connection to Phoenix Horizon exposed. Vale and his mercenaries faced federal charges, their advanced technology confiscated and contained. David Reeves returned to his classroom, though his students now looked at their history teacher with newfound respect. Murphy's Diner was repaired, its regular customers a bit more appreciative of the quiet veteran who graded papers in the corner booth. The events of that night became part of Pine Ridge's local legend, a reminder that appearances can be deceiving and that heroes sometimes hide in plain sight, grading history papers and drinking coffee in small-town diners. If this story of justice and hidden strength resonated with you, make sure to hit subscribe. Tomorrow's video about a special forces veteran facing down a corrupt small-town politician will absolutely blow your mind. Stay tuned.